Hello, everyone, and welcome to 180 Degrees of Impact. My name is Matt Scott, and I'm joined today by Lyndsey Scott, who is related to me. Hey, Lyndsey, how's it going?
I'm fine, my brother Matthew. How are you?
Great. And I think, you referred to me as your brother Matthew, but I think, this is my site, my interview. So you're my sister,
Oh,
Lindsay. But I could go into introducing you, explaining who you are, but I can't do your introduction justice because you are a woman of many talents. So I'd love if you could introduce yourself to the 180 Degrees of Impact audience.
okay. Well, I am Lindsay Scott. I am Matthew Scott's sister, and I've spent my post collegiate life as an actress, model, and iOS app developer. I'm currently living in LA, and yes, that's all that I have for my intro.
It's interesting. I get that. So I want to kind of get into more specifically uh, what you worked on because you really just, in one sentence, just like grazed over your career and your being a model and an app developer and even more your computer science skills.
And
So
actress, you forgot
and
actress.
actress too. Like
Yeah,
where? So what would you? I want to kind of take a step back.
sure.
I know just knowing your background that you weren't. You became a professional model after you graduated college. But I'd like to go way back to when you first started with app development and with computer science and coding. Um, the big question I know. See, I feel like I'm inserting a lot into our conversation because
That's
I
fine.
know a lot of the backgrounds, but for people who aren't aware, um, a lot of people ask you, Lyndsey, how does it feel to be a model and an app developer? Like, would you rather have beauty or brains? So I'd love to start, at the beginning. How did you get started developing your brains?
Well, I I I would read as a kid, and then I went to school. I went to preschool, then elementary school, then high school, then college. And in college, I'd already developed my brains, a little bit before then. But at a certain point, I found my way into computer science course. I was already a theater major. I knew that I 100% wanted to act after college, so that was important to me. But I also wanted to explore other subjects. I tried physics, I tried economics, and when I found my way into computer science course, it really felt like I was in the right place. So
Mhm.
that's when I started studying computer science.
When did you first code? When did you first begin to do that?
Um, well, that was when I really first got into coding, but I guess when I was much younger, I played around on my TI-89 graphing calculator, maybe when I was in middle school. And I didn't really think of it as coding at the time. So uh, it just dawned on me later, wait a second, that was kind of similar to what I finally ended up doing.
See, I'm curious why you started like fooling around on your TI-89. You said your
Yeah.
TI-89. Like as your brother, I didn't. I'm not a coder, so I'm wondering what was the impetus for you to begin
Yeah.
to code.
Well, at 12, I wasn't a coder either, and 12, you weren't a coder. So it was just a matter of checking out the resources that I had around me and exploring them. So I knew that people shared games on their graphing calculator. And then I saw that my calculator came with this huge book of documentation. So then I read it and I'm like, oh, I can create my own games. So
Wow.
I wasn't born a coder, just like you weren't, but just like anyone could at any point in their life, they can, or you can check out uh, the documentation, you could study programming, and then you might be a great coder yourself.
I mean, that's what people tell me. They always,
Yeah.
they
I know,
ask
I
me,
hear it all the time. Matthew, he's such a great coder. He's the greatest coder that never was.
they do tell me I'm a great coder.
Yeah,
I'm like, you know what? No, that's me, because they confuse me and you, because this actually might be a really confusing interview. People might have a hard time distinguishing
telling us apart.
you, and
Yeah,
yeah, I know it's really tough.
yeah,
But I guess just kind of going into it more, you mentioned your undergrad studying computer science.
yeah.
Um, but I think, for a lot of people, like for me, when I graduated college, that's really the time where, you have to make a decision about what you want to do in your life, or you're made to think you have to make a decision about what you want to do in your
Okay.
life.
Uh-huh.
Could you talk about, like, if that was a factor for you? Did you feel like you had to make a decision?
Oh yeah, no, my decision was made before college. I knew that I was going to act. So
Mhm.
as soon as I got out of college, I was on the internet. I was looking up auditions. I moved back in with my parents in New Jersey. Went back and forth between New Jersey and New York, just auditioning, meeting people. Shooting a lot of student films, independent films, etc. And then I eventually found my way into modeling as well.
I'm sure it's a tough business to get started in, though, the modeling and the acting, but
I guess it depends. Some people have the connections and the resources. They probably go out of school and they just know they get an agent right away and they do all that. It took a little time for me, but I guess I worked really hard. I just went out and kept meeting people until something stuck. So
mhm.
yeah, I found acting representation. Oh no, well, I became SAG very quickly, which is the Screen Actors Guild, the Actors
Mhm.
Union. And so that helped me get an agent. And because this modeling agency that I first signed with also had an acting agency, I figured, okay, let me just get with them for both acting and modeling.
Mhm. What were the most difficult parts, especially as you were getting started?
Just learning how to navigate everything. I think I was pretty savvy in a lot of ways. Like I didn't get scammed. I was probably really skeptical of, fortunately, people that put up auditions on the internet. I didn't trust most people. I did a lot of research, but I know that it's difficult for a lot of people who start out, and it's best to be very, very, very careful when you start out on your own.
Mhm.
Um, but I was lucky in that respect.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, I was lucky in several respects. I was able to stay at home with our parents, and I was able to commute back and forth into the city. And I was fortunate that I started making money quickly enough to not struggle too much, and to be
Mhm.
able to move out of our parents' house
Yeah.
within the first year and a half or so.
Wow. Yeah, it's crazy to think about that. I mean, that doesn't feel like it was that long ago, but you've done so much since then. Just to talk about, though, you mentioned the computer science aspect and having a college degree, and I know that a lot of models, might be in high school or might not be, as advanced as you were in terms of your education, especially. Like, how did you find that impacted you, just the fact that you had your more experience than a lot of other models?
So yeah, I mean the main difference was just our ages, like and just the times when we started modeling. Like many of those young women were just as educated as I was at their age.
Mhm.
A lot of them were still in school, or some of them had to leave their families, and skip school for a bit in order to travel the world and make money to send home. They had a lot of intelligence and experience that I definitely didn't have at their age, and didn't even have when I started modeling. Just the way that all these young girls are able to travel the world and just figure things out on their own, and take care of themselves. I mean, that's an intelligence that I would never say is less important than a formal education.
Mhm. Yeah, I think it's really interesting, though, because at least from my perspective, or from
Mm-hmm.
perspective of, I'm sure a lot of people who first heard of you because of modeling, like, from their perspective, they didn't know about your computer science education for
Mm-hmm.
the most part. And then from my perspective, I see you going after this modeling piece. Did you ever have any doubt that you would, end up where you are now, where you're full-fledged with your, feet in acting and modeling and app development?
Well, I didn't expect to be an app developer.
Mm-hmm.
There wasn't really any app development when I started after college. Like, that iPhone was brand new. They didn't allow iOS app development. So when I graduated from college, I didn't think there was any sort of programming that I would find particularly interesting. It was not at all on my radar. And even as a model and actress, I never, I didn't feel like a programmer at all. Like I had this education, but it was irrelevant to my life at that point in time, because I wasn't doing it and I didn't plan on doing it. But yeah, eventually, as time went on and the technologies developed, that's when it became more interesting to me.
Like, it sounds to me, though, from what you're explaining, that there was some thought that maybe you wouldn't, of course, be a programmer or an app developer.
No, there was no thought that I would be a programmer.
What was it that you envisioned, though, when you looked at your career after college? Was it like acting and modeling exclusively?
Probably right after college, acting exclusively. Modeling was sort of a surprise. And I was able to keep auditioning through the modeling process, but modeling was going so well that I had to travel a lot too. Mm-hmm. So I still had the opportunity to take acting classes and do great auditions. I was considered for some really great acting roles too along that point in time. But yeah, when modeling picked up, I took advantage of that opportunity and did a lot of modeling at the time, when originally I just thought I would do acting. I didn't realize that I was model material.
I get that. I usually, when I look in the mirror, I don't necessarily see it, but people tell me that I am a model.
Yeah,
so
all the time.
They tell you too that I'm a model.
Yeah, that you're a model. Yeah.
Oh wow, that's interesting. That sounds good. I just figured that I only heard it on Twitter, but anyway. So just to talk about the modeling for a little bit. How did you know that when did you really realize that modeling was something that you could commit to? Like, what were the opportunities that came up? And like, wow, I'm a model. I'm a supermodel.
Okay, well, even before I had any success, I first realized that I could get into this whole modeling thing when I would show up on set and the photo shoots felt a lot like acting, where I would be becoming these different characters. I would look at my clothes and the set, and I try to make my expression, my body, match the mood of whatever the artist was going for, the photographer. So I felt like an artist in a lot of ways as a model, that I also feel like an artist when I'm acting. But yeah, my first big modeling job came out of nowhere. It was an exclusive contract with Calvin Klein. I was the first African-American female model to land an exclusive contract with Calvin Klein. And so it was very exciting. And yeah, after that, I started doing campaign work I did a campaign for DKNY. I did several, I think, over the course of that year. And I ended up that fall doing shows for Prada, Gucci, Louis Vuitton, Diane von Furstenberg. I did a lot of work with Diane von Furstenberg, like print stuff. And I ended up just working with a lot of great designers. I ended up doing the Victoria's Secret show too that year. And I ended up shooting for great magazines, various Vogues from all over the world, and W Magazine, I shot with them a bunch. And lots of advertising work. And so with all of that, and I had, 7 agencies all over the world. So I was just traveling a lot and working a lot. I was sometimes on a plane 3 times a week for really long stretches of time. I was living in different countries. I had my apartment in New York, but I was also sometimes in London for up to 6 months, Paris, Berlin. I'd work in Milan, I'd work in Spain, all over.
Yeah.
LA too, sometimes.
I think it's really interesting. Like you were definitely clearly like neck deep in just modeling, and I'm sure also pursuing acting at the time, but
Yeah.
neck deep in that. Um, but I think the big reason why I thought you'd be so great for 180 Degrees of Impact is really like that turning point where things, I guess, at least from my perspective, changed overnight when you went from being recognized just as this model and actress to being recognized as an app developer. Could you talk about like what happened that led to that shift?
Okay, well, yeah, it definitely wasn't overnight. Maybe this aspect of recognition was, but by that point, I was used to recognition enough that I didn't take it too seriously. Like I know not to take articles about me or, even no matter how positive they are, it's only one aspect of yourself. Like this sort of public recognition just wasn't important to me aside from the fact that it helped me with my work. But other than that recognition, it definitely wasn't an overnight process. I think at a certain point, I was unhappy with my management, my modeling management in New York. So I left for Europe. I stayed in Paris for 6 months, and then I stayed in Berlin for 6 months. And during that entire year, right before I left, I started getting into iOS development because I got my first iPhone. And just the same way that I saw my TI-89 graphing calculator and said, oh, I could do that, I saw my iPhone and I thought, oh, I can make apps like that. Mm-hmm. So I started looking at documentation, looking up online, the YouTube videos that would teach me how to program for iOS. I learned Objective-C, which was the only language for iOS at the time. And I spent that year modeling. I think I did some work for Yves Saint Laurent quite a bit in Paris. And then I did a lot of fashion shoots, Harper's Bazaar, like a lot of fashion shoots in Berlin. But during that time, I was also coding a lot, just practicing, building my first apps, just to get my feet wet in programming. I would just keep programming all the time. And then by the time I got back to the US, and I found out that my agency that had agreed that I should go over to Europe a year ago, that they dropped me off their boards before I got back, like without saying a word. I'm like, whoa, what do I do now? And it became clear that I needed at least some extra control over my work life. So even though I found a new modeling agency and was able to get work still, I think I came back and I shot for CoverGirl and, a bunch of other beauty stuff. Even though I did have that modeling life, I started turning down some work to focus on the programming stuff just so that I could build that up a bit more in case I needed that as a source of income.
Yeah, I think it's powerful. Like obviously it was definitely a journey to the point where you were, like, as you mentioned, embracing app development more. But I think what the thing that I have in my mind is I think of Cora, and I think of you posting about your posting pictures of you from when you were growing up versus next to like your Victoria's Secret pictures. And it's funny because recently, like maybe a couple weeks ago or in the last week or so, I've looked at different interviews, and I mean, we could get into that or we don't have to get into it, but a lot of the questions and just the concept behind it is like, it's difficult because I know for Cora, for instance, the headline was something to the effect of, I used to be nerdy or ugly and now I'm beautiful. How did that feel at the time, and how does that experience of this thing going viral feel now? In terms of the Cora post kind of, again, really going viral in terms of people upvoting it or choosing to share. I know it was the headline in Cora's newsletter for the week. And so I'm curious
Well,
how that felt the time
I
that,
answered the question of my own volition. It's not
yeah,
like I was tricked into answering it in some
no.
way. I think at the time I was feeling kind of down because um, I I'd released some apps like I geared towards the fashion industry,
Mhm.
and no one was responding to me, even though these people were so. I'd walk into a room before and they'd be like, Lyndsey, how are you? And then as soon as I disappeared to Europe for a bit and came back and put out apps, it was silence. And I was kind of down about that, but I was also, I'd been away for a while. So I didn't have the same close friendships that I had in New York when I came back. And I came back, I had a birthday party. It was really, really cold outside, but barely anyone showed up. And so I'm like, okay, this feels very familiar, and very, I guess there was, at the time, I still harbored some sort of insecurities from not being super popular or like popular at all as a kid or a teenager,
Mhm.
etc. And then still struggling to have these connections with people as an adult, even though I was a successful model, it still was a struggle.
Mhm.
So I think I wrote that. I must have written that at 3 a.m. after programming. I was programming all night, and I was probably like in a daze. And I saw this email come in from Cora, and I answered it. And I didn't expect it to get. I didn't realize that Cora was so big at the time, where like
Right.
all these people would be answering it. I mean, or responding to me and liking it and syndicating the post on different news sites. I didn't expect that at all, and I was a little freaked out in the morning when I'm like, oh, what did I get myself into? But it was definitely my honest feelings at that point in time. Just this this shift in life where people will view you one way at one point in time based on your physical appearance, and then things will change and in the way they treat you. But I was still feeling like the same person, dealing with the same insecurities in spite of the way that I might have appeared to the world. So I remember answering that question just because it felt like something I was processing in my mind at that particular point in time and that I wanted to get out.
Mhm.
And yeah, then that post took off, and it quickly transformed into Model as a Programmer story. I couldn't even keep up with the news transformation. Like I didn't one person would do an interview about one thing, and then the interview changed topics in the next interview. Like there was a whole new topic, and then there's a whole new topic, and eventually the story just kept evolving until it was a Model as a Programmer story, as
Yeah.
opposed to what it feels like to go from ugly duckling to beautiful swan story.
And I think it's really interesting though, because even still with the Model is a Programmer story, like I think there are so many, I don't know how many articles or interviews has happened with you. And I remember being at Good Morning America for the interview.
Yeah.
Also, there was another interview, I don't remember who it was with, but similarly, it almost seemed like the conversation was always like, do you have a hard time like dating with your dating life and so on and so forth? And I that's something that I think is interesting. Like you were faced with having these this really good story where it's talking about how intelligent you are, and yet at the same time a lot of the focus would be on uh, these things that are more, I'd say, tabloid focused.
Yeah. I mean, that's how a lot of the news is, though, nowadays. And you were there that
Yeah.
day at Good Morning America, and you saw how I tried to avoid the dumb questions or the
Right.
questions that weren't really pertinent to like the fact that here I am on national TV. I'm trying to promote computer science education. I'm trying
Yeah.
to get more young women and minorities into programming. And here are these questions that are more like tabloid sort of fodder.
I,
So I tried to avoid them the best that I could. But I gave them a little bit of what they needed for their news show.
mm,
Um, but Yeah, I remember there's also the Bloomberg TV interview.
That's probably the one.
Yeah, people found that a bit funny how he asked what it was like being an object.
Yeah.
And I responded, at least in a way that made him know that I never felt like an object as a model.
Yeah.
But yeah, there is that tabloid aspect to it. And I think because of that, I remember there was the CNN article, and I rarely look at comments for articles, but the comments were just full of things saying that I'm probably not a real programmer, that someone's doing my code for me, that anybody could be a programmer, that it's easy to make apps, or that even things about my appearance. Somebody wrote that I looked like I went 10 rounds with a prize fighter in a ring, you know, just horrible things. Like, people were just nasty all the way around.
Yeah.
But I mean, I really just wanted to use that attention to promote the need for more diversity in computer science and technology. It's so important in so many ways. For our economy, it's important for, you know, just to level that playing field so that not all power and technology lies with, you know, white men, as it currently does now. I think it's super important to promote diversity in tech, and I tried, but of course there's a part of doing these sort of model as coder interviews that got very tiresome, because it was hard to get the points across when they wanted to make it a clickbait sort of story.
I mean, as you mentioned, it wasn't necessarily the easiest opportunity, especially with a lot of the questions you were being asked. But, you know, over time, one thing I'm wondering is, have you seen a change in the questions that people are asking you when you do interviews? Do you think that the dynamic is changing? Because I look back at it now, especially, and I'm sure I saw all of it at the time, but now I look back, like, if I show this to one of my friends, for instance, they would say, oh, that was like fun, like Lyndsey's a model. But now they'd say, like, whoa, those questions were like a little bit like, you know, whatever you want to call them.
Is this what would you call it? The Weinstein Revolution?
Right. Yeah. I mean, especially now. But have the questions changed for like the interviews that you're?
Well, I don't do as many interviews about it, because it's like, I never really wanted to be branded in that way. I thought that it was a good opportunity to spread awareness and educate people. But one, I don't do as much modeling as I used to. I do a lot of acting. I do programming for companies. Like, I'm not doing my own apps. I'm doing lots of client work. And so I'm really busy. I am doing everything that I love doing. But I don't necessarily feel like doing these interviews, because it just becomes a way to promote myself as this model programmer combo that sort of disregards the actual point of my doing these interviews.
I want to definitely take a step back to the point of doing the interviews and talking more about that. But first, tell me about, this is probably really going to be difficult for you, because I know there are a lot of apps that you've worked on, but like, what apps have you built since you started coding apps? I'll limit it to the last 10 years maybe, to like make it a little bit easier.
Well, I haven't been doing iOS app development for 10 years. I've done programming for longer than that, but not iOS app development. You know, I've done a lot of client work, and I've done tutorials. I do tutorials for a site called Ray Wenderlich. But I've done tutorials on optical character recognition, Apple Maps and routing, Google Cardboard. I think I just released an update to the optical character recognition tutorial. Core Text, which is like a text rendering tutorial. so I've done a lot of tutorials for that site that include apps that I make for specifically for the tutorials. And for clients, I tend to do a lot of work I love doing work that involves video and images. I like visual apps. One of my clients now, it's not very visual, but it's still a charity-based app, and I like doing that as well. I can talk about apps that I've done, but the thing is I don't maintain them. They're no longer active because it doesn't pay the bills the same way as the client work does. So yeah, I mean, all I would really say about the apps that I do now is that I do apps that are fun to make visually in some way. I tend to do that, and I like to put my own spin on whatever a client is asking for. And I work with great companies now, you know, with lots of people where I'm the solo iOS developer, and that's a great feeling to have so much control over a particular aspect of the company that I'm so fond of. I love iOS specifically more than any other programming I've done. And yeah, I'm very fortunate that I get to have a flexible schedule with programming. I don't go into an office. I get to work from home. I'm allowed to set my own hours. And I just am able to do that. I'm able to do my acting classes every week. I'm able to go to my auditions. I'm able to shoot any acting roles I might get. So I feel very lucky that I'm able to do all of that right now.
Right. And I think you just mentioned a lot, but at the same time,
I just realized that.
It only scratches the surface of, you know, what the work that you've done. And I think about like what you were talking about with promoting diversity in tech, and like a different face of tech is how I'll sum it up in terms of, you know, not being white man centric. Could you talk about like where that notion came from, of like why you decided that it was important for you to use that platform to talk about?
That's a good question. I think around that time that I started getting media attention for the programming, I'd been trying to build up my coding profile in order to maybe get some programming work, because it was very difficult to convince people at first that I was a programmer. I guess I didn't fit the typical programmer stereotype. And so I, in order to try to convince people that I was a real programmer, I started answering a lot of questions on this site called Stack Overflow. And I was faced during that time with some sexism, some comments that would mention the fact that I was a model and that I should go back to wearing lingerie or something instead of pretending to be a programmer, you know. So I realized during that time, and even if I answered people's questions on Stack Overflow, they would assume that I was a man. Like they say, "Thanks, man. Thanks, bro." And they're like, "No, I'm not your bro." But even when you go to hackathons or events, whenever I'm around programmers, even now, I realize that I don't look like everyone else. And I think it's important for women and minorities to have spaces where they feel more comfortable in many ways, but in this case, when it comes to computer programming and computer science and technology, just to be able to walk in a room and feel like you belong it can be difficult when you're often dealing with a lot of personality types with these programmers who don't necessarily know how to interface with women or people unlike them in programming or science environment. So I felt like it was really important to make it a better space for me to even be in, to try to have, you know, just try to feel more comfortable, and like even just let these typical programmers know that there are other programmers out there who don't look like them, but they can be just as great as they are, even though we're not so visible. So I thought it was important in that sense for programmers now, but I also think it's important for people just to know that that it's possible for them to become programmers in a society that's becoming so technology driven. It's not only possible, but it's important. It's becoming more and more important. And I think a lot of people don't know anything about what programming is. They just hear it. They're like, okay, that sounds scary. That sounds like something I can't do. And especially with women, I realize I hear often that they might not know anything about programming. They didn't have the resources growing up. It's not like schools are becoming better about teaching kids computer science and programming, but it's not always accessible. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's important for people who might not normally just get that introduction into programming and computer science to just see, okay, there are people out there that look like me who are into this and who love it. Maybe there's this chance that I could be into this too. Mm-hmm. I think it's nice to see role models that look like you. I think it makes it easier to see yourself in that same place.
Yeah.
So if I can help inspire some people who can identify with me in whatever way, then great. And I do like using whatever platform I have in order to influence and educate and serve as a role model in some way for future app developers, etc.
Yeah, I think and I'll also say, of course, as you know, this applies to a lot of women in tech and people of color in tech, where like clearly through all that you've mentioned about your skills, like even though you were recognized, we could go on and on with all the different publications, like you were still sold short in terms of what you accomplished, and you still are in a lot of ways. Like I think of the fact that, you've spoken now, for instance, you've spoken at Facebook and a bunch of other events and conferences. So I'm
Harvard,
all over the world.
Yeah,
so
it's pretty cool.
But the one that comes to mind for me is the one of the few that I went to, which was Hack Holyoke at Mount Holyoke.
With Alexis Ohanian.
Yeah, co-founder of Reddit. And I remember that because, and also, I remember that because I witnessed you two, doing what you were doing at the event, but I also really witnessed people, I think of Eva Snyder, who was the co-founder or the founder of Hack Holyoke at the time, has since graduated and I believe is now working at either Google or YouTube. But I think of how people looked at you to think wow, this is someone who I want to be like in a lot of ways one day. I know, but
yeah.
But, do you have stories like that, or is there one story or a couple of stories that just resonate with you or stand out, where you met someone and you're like, wow, I didn't realize that I had that much of an impact on people?
Yeah, there were several times. I've had many girls come up to me and just express that sort of thing, and it's I can barely believe it, that I've inspired them as much as I have. That Hack Holyoke was such a beautiful experience, though. Mm-hmm. Those young women were such great programmers, so smart, and I went to school at Amherst, one of the 5 colleges that right near Mount Holyoke. So it was kind of nice going back to that sort of environment. I felt a sense of recognition. When it came to that area, it's a special sort of area with special people, and it was nice to go back to that level of open-mindedness and academic curiosity, mm-hmm. And the young women at that hackathon and the other half of students there who were young men. It was a 50-50 hackathon.
Mhm.
And just the fact that everyone there was, both men and women were trying to promote that idea of diversity in programming and technology, and that they were doing it in a way that was so respectful and easy. I thought it was just so beautiful, that event. I thought it was great.
Mhm. Yeah. I think overall, like we could go on forever, and this interview is definitely going to be a little bit longer than most of them, but I'm okay with that. I think just to kind of get to approach the end of the interview, I'm curious, like what piece of advice or what pieces of advice do you have for like I think especially for the young women, but I'll say in general for people um, like you who didn't see themselves in uh, this tech, computer science, coding, hackathon realm.
Mm-hmm. I guess my piece of advice would be to stay curious. You know, if there's something that you even might be a little interested in, or something that you hear about, why not go out and research it and find it out if it's something that's for you? Because I think a lot of people miss a lot of opportunities in life by not stepping outside their comfort zone.
Mhm.
Um, so I guess that would be my main bit of advice. Just try, you know, sometimes it doesn't hurt to try.
Yeah, I think that's powerful advice and it's simple, but that's really great advice. And again, one thing I think is really impressive about your work is that like I've even noticed it doesn't take a lot. At Holyoke, I was really
Oh yeah.
in the sense that, for instance, you would have a short conversation with one person and then I would see them and they're like, oh my gosh, I just had a conversation with Lyndsey.
Yeah, but the nice thing about hackathons is
Yeah.
that I get to educate too. Like
Right.
I get to explain, well, but that hackathon I didn't get to do as much because, well, one, they knew what they were doing, but
Mhm.
two, I specifically, my expertise is app development, and there were some app developers there, and I was able to help with even Android stuff too, since the logic is, I mean, in general, programming logic is
Mhm.
similar, but the hardware is also similar enough that I, understood what was going on. But yeah, I love educating. I
Mhm.
love to go to these hackathons and teach people new things. Um, for example, there's a yearly hackathon at UCLA that is so much fun to be able to walk around and just help everyone with their code.
Oh,
Um,
yeah.
I love that sort of thing. But yeah, even without knowing all the technical stuff, or even without going into long technical explanations,
Mhm.
that little bit of encouragement or knowledge or anything could go a long way.
Mhm. Absolutely. Uh, I guess I have two more questions for you. But, I guess the first I'll ask is, what do you see as being like your next steps or your goals for your career? And you could take that however you want, whether with modeling or acting or with app development. I'm curious, like what you see on the horizon or what your
Well, yeah,
goals are.
I feel like I'm in a really good, I'm in a really good swing of things right now, where I have this freedom with the programming, where I have these great contracts with great companies and great flexibility. And I'm also being able to do the acting stuff. I guess the next steps would be to uh, book more of the acting stuff and continue on with programming around that, because no matter how great my entertainment careers can be, and I know from experience, there's just no guarantee. So it's nice that I have clients that are accepting of my schedule and will let me work um, a range of hours per week in order to keep me on the team. So I hope to keep developing with my art and my love for science. And I guess whatever happens, happens. I'll just keep trying my best.
I'll get
and
to
improving.
And improving.
Yeah, improving. I'm always trying to educate myself. That's why I do my acting classes. I'll as I do work with more clients, I try to step into new technologies and find out the latest and greatest stuff that I could implement. And when I do my tutorials, I learn a lot. I often do tutorials for Ray Wenderlich about things that I know nothing about, just in order to learn about them. And the same for answering questions on Stack Overflow. Now I think I'm in the top 1% of programmers who've answered questions on their site. And one way in which I've learned a lot is by answering questions that I don't know the answers to take some time to do a little research and come up with an answer to someone else's question. That's how I learned Swift. I started out knowing just Objective-C. I spent a month answering questions about this new Apple programming language called Swift, and that's how I learned to program in both. And so I think this need for me to be curious and to strive and just to always try to improve. I hope it never leaves me, and I hope that it leads me to my next adventure.
Yeah, I think as I get to my final question, I keep thinking of the question that I feel like you've gotten. I couldn't tell you how many times, but probably dozens of times, which is like, would you rather have beauty or brains? Like, would you rather? And it's such a ridiculous question, and I just want to. I don't even think you need to address that. It's like the most frustrating question, though, that would be asked. And I just wanted to comment before I get to my last question, which is not that I hope that that's not a question that like you continue to get, but also that that's not a question that like women get for any field, because I know it's not even like a modeling exclusive thing. Like there's so many variations of that. But my last question is a question I always end with. If your life were a book or documentary, what would the title be and why?
Yes, I've thought long and hard about this question, actually, just assuming that you would ask it to me. And
of course.
Well, I came up with this brilliant title, Lyndsey's Life, okay? Because it would be about my life. So, but beyond that, beyond that brilliant title, I have a feeling that I've still got a lot of life to live, and that title might change eventually. Give it a few years, and I will have the final title for my book ready. And hopefully I'll be able to look back at lots of accomplishments and put them all together in a way that would look really, really great on a book or whatever the DVDs of the future are.
Maybe on Netflix, which would be...
I think in the future Netflix too. I think whatever, maybe dial into people's head and they'll say, oh, the title of my book or DVD or MP3 or MP, whatever.
I'm just shocked because every time I've asked that question, that's the first time someone has, you have a self-titled book or documentary.
Yeah.
That's really innovative.
Yeah. But I think my title has yet to be written.
I got it.
There you go.
Speaking of titles and things that are written, like that segue, where can people find you online and connect with you online? Okay,
well, I have my website, www.lyndseyscott.com, and my name's spelled Lyndsey, Scott, with 2 T's.com. And they can also find me on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at Lyndsey360, also with that same Lyndsey spelling.
Awesome.
So, yeah.
Awesome. And for anyone who wants to learn more about 108 Degrees of Impact, again, I'm assuming you might already know where to
Yeah, I'm a
find it.
huge fan.
Interview. Of course, yeah, you do. I know that you're
Oh,
a big fan, the biggest fan. But for anyone who's watching, you can visit www.lets.care. It's LETS.CARE. Just
wow, what a great domain name. It's so easy to remember and just so right to the point.
thank you. And by the way, on all of the platforms, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, it's at Let's You Care. That's at Let's YOU Care.
That's even
Follow, like, comment,
better.
subscribe, share, all of the above. And Lyndsey, thanks again
Yeah.
for joining. This has been
Thank you
great.
for having me.
All of your wisdom is amazing, and I'm sure that I'll hear a lot of feedback about this interview. And for anyone who's watching, until next time, keep impacting. I'm gonna
Keep
stop.
impacting.
Wait, I don't think they know which one of us is which though.